Hey y'all, here at OS Reviews. Today we're taking a closer look at the Xgody P40. So like other products from this company that we've seen in the past, this is another super budget Android smartphone that sells for around 80 bucks and otherwise has a very large 6.8-inch display. Now if you guys recall, about a few months back we did check out another phone from them called the K30, and this phone also has a very similar overall dimension and footprint. So the only difference is this K30 has a lower resolution display, which is quarter HD, around 540 by 960 pixels. So on such a large display, it is a little easier to see the pixelation versus this new model, the P40, has a higher resolution that is now 720p, so it should look a little bit more crisp. But everything else in terms of this phone is very similar to that other K30, has the same MediaTek quad-core processor, and also has a 5 megapixel rear camera. It has just 8 gigs of built-in storage, which is quite low, but thankfully you can expand on it using a micro SD card, but for a light version of Android it should be alright. Has also a 3000 milliamp hour capacity battery, and there is built-in GPS, the typical stuff like built-in Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, as expected these days. So one other thing that is notable here is the cellular bands are limited to 3G connectivity. So if you are browsing the web, for instance, you really want to use the Wi-Fi for the fastest internet connection, but if you're doing things like making calls and text messages, obviously 3G speeds will still suffice. Alright, so here is the phone itself. Other contents in the box are very similar to their other devices. It includes a charging cable, also a wall adapter using USB, and there is an extra tempered glass screen protector which comes with the package, just like their other phones in the past. There is a SIM ejector tool and even a second plastic or film screen protector included, quick user guide, and a free TPU soft carrying case. We can peel back this film here on the back, and we have a very dazzling finish on this phone. Although this is plastic and not glass, it still glistens and has a very beautiful finish that is gradient, slightly shimmers and changes colors according to how you point it at the light, and it is a very attractive overall finish, I have to say, for a budget phone. It is a unibody device, which means the back cover can't be removed. You can't swap out the battery on this one, so that is one thing to keep in mind, but overall has a decent weight. Now in terms of the naming as well as the design, it is very heavily inspired by the much more expensive Huawei P40, so this is basically Xgody's copy of that, including the Leica branding, which is obviously not going to be real. In fact, some of the extra lenses here are also not real camera sensors. It has just a primary 5 megapixel lens. The rest are for decorative purposes. Rails here also have a blue kind of shimmer to it, so it looks quite pretty. There is a volume rocker along with a power key, which is textured, by the way, so it feels a little bit different from the other keys. It's pretty easy to click on and feels tactile enough. One of the other slight quirks of this phone, though, is the bottom here houses a speaker, microphone, and the charging port, which is unfortunately micro USB. It is a little disappointing considering that in the K30 that we saw from before, they had already migrated to USB Type-C, so this seems to be a slight step backwards. However, this phone does still preserve a standard 3.5mm headphone jack, which is missing on the K30 that we saw from before. So if you do like to use traditional wired headphones, higher quality headphones, this is going to be a plus, but in the other area for charging, it's going to be a slight step back. And on the front here, we have just the phone's main display. We have a small earpiece on the top, but we have the aforementioned cutout for the hole punch notch, although it is still technically connected to the top bezel portion, so there isn't really a full circular cutoff. There is still a portion here which is linked, but overall it's still fairly non-obtrusive and presents a pretty symmetrical look as far as the other bezels are concerned, and for watching videos it remains a pretty comfortable experience, almost feels like you're holding onto content, and definitely makes it seem like a more expensive phone, although there is a slightly larger chin on the bottom as you can see there, but it's still not too bad for a device in this range. Ultimately though, this is still a very large phone, or a phablet, since it has that 6.8-inch dimension. Now that selfie camera is a bit more obvious if you have a white background like this, but in certain scenarios where you have a wallpaper that kind of just blends into the section here in the dark, and non-obtrusive. Now, as far as the overall system is concerned, it is actually a little different from the aforementioned K30, which from Xgody, they were actually using a Android Go build of the operating system, versus on this one, it seems like they're using a regular version or the full version of Android. I say that because on the K30, it came with some Go edition of Google apps, like Gmail Go, there's Assistant Go, Maps Go, which are a bit more light and optimized to run better on a device that has less powerful hardware like these phones. Again, they have the same entry-level processor from MediaTek, clocked at 1.3 gigahertz, so very entry-level by today's standards. However, this phone here seems to actually have a slightly different launcher, and again, it doesn't come with the Go edition of apps, but rather the full-blown editions of their counterparts. And that does take up a little bit more power for them to run, so I would have preferred if they just stuck with Android Go, to be honest, considering the entry-level specs, but that is something interesting that I wanted to quickly point out. And as a whole, it's not a shabby display for the price. Definitely has a decent overall experience, thanks to the fact that it is now, again, finally HD plus resolution, so at least text does look sharper. Viewing angles are also decent as expected for an IPS panel, so you can see that colors don't wash out too easily, although the brightness level can definitely be perhaps a little bit brighter, but for this price range, it's still acceptable. Otherwise, phone comes with a few gestures here, including double tap to wake it up from sleep, and in terms of the regular navigation of the UI, it's okay in terms of the fluidity, doesn't feel too bad, and general tasks still open up without too much issues. We do have physical keys on the bottom, although gesture navigation is disabled by default. Perhaps that's a purposeful choice since there will be more animations with gestures that can boggle down the phone, so they just stuck with permanent keys on the bottom there. Otherwise, the launcher here again is a little bit more customized than before, not really stock, but we still have access to quick launch shortcuts for turning on or off Wi-Fi, data connectivity. By default, there's also no drawer of applications, so there is no kind of swipe up to access that full list of apps like on stock Android devices. For some reason, that's been disabled here, but you can always bring that back if you prefer by downloading something like Nova Launcher. All right, diving closer into the phone's performance, starting off with the camera, overall it's acceptable, but by no means this is going to be kind of a camera-centric phone. As expected as a device in this price range, it's only going to scrape by as far as getting you, some quick shots that you can capture and save, as well as, maybe documents you want to scan in. And as a whole, color reproduction looks decent. Perhaps the only downside is 5 megapixels is not a ton of detail or sharpness that you can pull in compared to, other phone sensors these days, which have, say, 13 or even higher. So if you start to zoom in, you'll definitely notice a lot more fuzziness. But from afar, the image still looks decent enough for some quick snaps, and not bad just for quickly sharing, as you can see there. You do have to remain relatively still since there is no built-in optical image stabilization. With that being said, overall not too shabby if you just want to have a basic camera on your device and don't have super high expectations. I tried it out with T-Mobile here in the Seattle region, and calls went through without too much issue. Since the phone's body is constructed out of plastic, reception quality does seem to be alright. You'll roughly receive around 2 bars of both reception for cellular and for Wi-Fi. Caller said that I sounded pretty clean without too much issues. Let's jump into a quick look at YouTube. Alright, so turning the sound down there, takeaway would be the overall experience is decent. We do have the advantage of a very large display, and in terms of watching back videos at 720p, you can see there that is the maximum resolution that the screen can support, and still looks decent. As a whole, it's an enjoyable enough experience as far as watching YouTube videos are concerned. The speaker on the side here is not going to be the loudest in the world, but as a benefit, it doesn't distort or sound too tinny either. Even if you turn the volume higher, you can hear in that demo there, sounds decent in terms of clarity, and also if you kind of put your hand on the side, doesn't seem to completely muffle it up, so there is a bit of room for the sound to escape from the other edges, and so as a whole remains a okay experience for a built-in speaker. You can see that videos also load back at a relatively good speed in terms of buffering and scrubbing between parts of the video, also handles it pretty well too, although some of the animations can definitely encounter moments of hesitation, as you can see there. It's not to the extent where it becomes frustrating to use, it still is okay, I would say, as far as expectations for a low-cost phone is concerned. Jumping into web browsing, let's try loading back a page like The Verge, and if you're using the mobile version of sites, it still renders it actually fairly quickly, again, thanks to the pretty decent Wi-Fi reception speed on here with the antennas. Sometimes more complex pages with lots of ads and videos might take some time longer for everything to completely load, but as a whole, not too shabby. Everything is still usable, and you can still scroll decently in terms of the fluidity here. I can also pinch to zoom, and that also works okay. One thing to keep in mind though is the phone just has 1 GB of RAM, which is very entry level these days. Again, it's just enough for most budget phones and for Android Go edition phones to have, but it means you can't do a ton of multitasking, or you have to be very conscious of that. Same thing goes with having multiple tabs open. You want to keep that to a minimum. We can notice the MediaTek chipset here, quad-core, is indeed true, as well as the fact that it is technically running on an Android version 10.0, so okay in terms of up-to-date. Perhaps the last thing to talk about here would just be very light gaming. Again, the device here is quite entry-level. Things which are too graphically demanding, such as, say, Asphalt series or PUBG, will definitely be too taxing, I think, on this entry-level phone. Here will handle lighter games the best, things like Stack, Fruit Ninja, older titles in particular, lighter ones for kids, is really where it will still be a decent experience. And again, loading times will still seem acceptable. Really, last but not least, the 3000 milliamp hour capacity battery is also decent, I feel, for the price range here. It's not the largest capacity in the world, considering that we do have a pretty large display, but it still lasted me through the entire day, and the phone can fully charge up in around an hour and a half, so decently fast top-up speeds as well, although it is, again, using micro USB. Now, the phone itself, it doesn't get too hot, I'd say, in terms of the processor. Even when you're doing some more demanding tasks, it gets a little bit warm towards the bottom region, but never gets too hot. This also isn't really a chip that thermal throttles or anything like that. It's a pretty tried and tested old chipset by today's standards, without too many surprises or, again, thermal throttling or anything crazy like that. So that is more or less it as far as our hands-on review of the new Xgody P40. And this is a phone that I think overall is still a decent value for the low price range, although there are a few mixed feelings. One of them being that, of course, there are benefits here compared to their past phones, including the fact that they are finally using a higher resolution display for the same price, which is great, and there is now a headphone jack, which they've brought back, which is awesome as well. Although some slight cons here is, again, using micro USB again instead of USB-C, as well as the fact that they stuck with a full version of Android and has a slightly thicker skin compared to the more light Android Go that they chose in the past version. Basic phone for making calls, browsing the web, and watching some videos without doing anything too demanding. I think it still can be a pretty good fit. It's hard to find many other competitors in the same price range that will give you as large of a screen and with a pretty modern design like this one that is, again, for something that is very cheap. Thanks for watching here at OS Reviews. That's been a closer look at Xgody's new ultra-budget smartphone. This has been the P40.